Kids, it is Derek Taylor, your teacher for Western Civ 2. Because our little class got canceled today because of the bad weather, I am recording my lecture on Charles Darwin and the Origin of Species for you, so you should be watching this, give you some background on reading the selections I gave you from Darwin, as well as, and I'll send you an email, a little selection by Thomas Huxley on called Evolution and Ethics. We'll get to that in a moment. But want to start out, give me a lecture, you should go to Canvas, find the lecture slides. I went up there last night, or a couple of nights ago, actually. And lecture for this week is titled Evolution as Revolution. Cute little title, Charles Darwin and the Theory of Evolution. And so we've seen the last 2 weeks a couple of literary, philosophical takes on the changing relationship between, humanity and nature. And this week we're getting, the godfather of such changes, Charles Darwin, and his introduction of a theory of evolution into Victorian society, which was a sensation, of course. And Darwin is still with us, as we'll see in many ways, and still some controversy over his ideas. But I think, as we'll see, more controversy over how his ideas relate to anything outside of science. But you can go through the key terms there. I'm going through this stuff. I fortunately can't show it in the video, but 6 key terms: natural selection, Thomas Malthus; social Darwinism; sexual selection, Charles Lyell and Thomas Huxley. Lots of dudes there are your key terms. And so the first part of the lecture I'm calling Evolution Before Darwin. I'll give a definition of this. Evolution basically means, I'll give a basic definition for us, it's change of organic species over time, both changes within species, but also going from one species to another. That's all we mean by the term evolution. One thing to know is this term existed long before Charles Darwin and his and people like Herbert Spencer used the term in the 19th century. And it was used originally to designate the development of a human embryo in the womb. So interesting background. The other thing is that this idea of evolution in terms of biological species actually goes back to the ancient world. It's not new, as in a philosophical matter. Ancient Greek philosophers, the pre-Socratics, the philosophers working prior to Socrates, as well as philosophers in ancient India, were also aware of this idea. Actually, Thomas Huxley will mention this in Evolution and Ethics. So it's not necessarily a new thing with Darwin. Now, when you get to modern theories of evolution, you begin to have changes introduced by modern scientific thinkers. One of the most important of these is a man named Georges Leclerc, the Comte de Buffon, a very prominent natural historian of the 18th century, who wrote a very famous work called Natural History General Particular, in which he presented his, and again, natural history is, you're collecting, fossils and stuff like this. But he very famously inserted an introduction to his natural history, which he basically propagated a naturalistic understanding of nature. That is to say, he's a materialist, and it's pretty clear. It's a philosophical, not a scientific thing. He claimed sort of absolute certitude for what he called, quote, concrete material relations, unquote, between organisms. He called this physical truth against what he saw as the more mathematical abstractions of, physics, which is based on mathematics. And this is important. It's important change because his idea of species, therefore, differed substantially from the traditional version of this. Before, species merely meant a class of beings, but in Buffon's writing, it came to mean material succession over time. So you're getting the idea of, okay, material change over time being an important thing here. Although, by the way, he still adheres to the immutability of species in his work, so lays the groundwork for Darwin to a certain degree. And this shifts even further with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who is famous, one of the pre-Darwinian scientists, who is famous for first working out a fully fledged theory of evolution in scientific terms. His idea was species start out as simple forms and then develop into more complex forms. In fact, he's probably best remembered, if you know his name at all, for his theory of acquired characteristics, inheritance of acquired characteristics, by which he thought species change over. That is to say, you grow up, you buff yourself up to a 250-pound linebacker. You're in your lifetime. You go from like a 150-pound weakling to a 250-pound linebacker in your lifetime. Your son will automatically inherit that. That's the idea basically he had. Um, the other thing about Lamarck is that he had a notion of evolution, which is teleological. That's to say, he thought it was working toward um, a natural endpoint. By the way, the natural endpoint is human beings. Evolution, the process emerges with its endpoint, which is us. So it's very much fitted into, most theories of nature prior to the 19th century, by the way, are influenced by natural theology, by some sort of, again, God created some sort of creationism, if you like. I'm going to put it in those terms. I don't mean that in a negative sense, by the way. It's just the way they thought. Um, and so, finally, the last guy we have up there on the slide, Robert Chambers, and he's sort of an illustration of how this idea gets into popular circulation by the 1840s. His very popular work, The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, um, made a bold claim that species develop progressively over time from lower to higher forms. His book was really, really controversial, but also popular, both in Britain and America, and it kind of softened up, public opinion for the reception of his idea. So it was very important in that regard. Um, and so you have all these influences, affecting Darwin prior to his actual publication of his work. He also had some non-biological influences. You can see from the next slide. Two people in particular very important for his thinking. One is a man named Charles Lyell, The Principles of Geology, which was published in the early 1830s. Particularly his idea of uniformitarianism. And this influenced Darwin to think of changes over a long span of time. And again, one of the things, and I'll come back to this in a moment, about the early 19th century is you're having changes in the way people see time, and I'll come back to that. But the idea that laws are uniform across space and time, in his thinking, Lyell's he mentions, by the way, Charles Lyell in the selections I give you of The Origin of Species. So he gets those ideas from Charles Lyell from geology, and then from Thomas Malthus, he gets an idea of population. In particular, the idea that um, population, when it's unchecked, tends to outstrip its food supply available for survival. The little tag phrase I have on the slide is as a population increases geometrically, food supply increases arithmetically, which is to say, population outstrips food supply. And so this leads to, of course, you have to have cataclysms that sort of reduce the population. That's what Malthus was theorizing in 1798, which, by the way, he was wrong. It turns out in the long run we know he was wrong. Again, Malthus gets a mention. Darwin's very honest about his sources. He's not taking this from science. He's taking this from these other thinkers. By the way, Malthus was an Anglican clergyman, so he was doing this stuff in his spare time in 1798. So arguing for things like population control. So he has these non biological influences in his thinking. And finally, just a brief note about where science is at in the early 19th century Britain. And first thing to note is that some people will refer to Darwin's publication of his theories, their reception, as a second scientific revolution. Now, we talked about this a little bit the first time when we talked about Galileo. I'm not necessarily um, all that comfortable with that idea, and we talked about it. But this way, I think the change is obviously huge. I mean, in terms of society, I'm not sure it's necessarily as big of a change as what happened in the 16th, 17th centuries, honestly. I think this is, in terms of the internal dynamics of, the progress of science, not as important. It's more important I think, for social reasons. And you have this in the early part of the 19th century. You know, one of the big things going on, of course, is that for the first time you're seeing really big technological things. Invention of the steam engine, the invention of a whole different bunch of other things, reshaping society. And really, this is, again, Enlightenment idea has been around for a long time. They haven't produced that yet. So you have, on the one hand, preceding these ideas of evolution getting into public circulation, changes that are already taking place. And I'm, by the way, particularly thinking about industrialization. I know I've been mentioning this for weeks on end. I probably should have talked about it already, but I wanted to save it for Marx, and we still have a couple weeks away from him. But industrialization is really important. I want to talk about at the end of my lecture the reception of Darwinian ideas, because we tend to think of it being this big break, and it is in some ways with how we see human nature. But I think it maybe is not as important as industrialization. Industrialization, I think, has a bigger impact on society in many ways. And but at the time, these technological advances are associated with enlightened ideas. So that's a big thing. Third thing I want to mention, just point out, is that most scientists by Darwin's day, in Darwin's day, as we think of it, they were amateurs. They were not members of universities. This is something to keep in mind. Science had not been professionalized, not been embodied in big, centralized organizations like we're aware with today. Um, and so it's beginning to change, between, practical stuff done in, workshops and factories, and then stuff done in the study of natural philosophy. It's still, natural philosophy, as I mentioned, is still the way people refer to it in the universities. It takes a long time. I'll get to this at the end of the lecture for what we think of as the natural sciences to take their place within a university curriculum. Universities, by the way, whatever I know most professors, you probably think of being, wild-eyed radical types, whatever their particular beliefs, universities as institutions are horribly conservative. And they never accept new ideas quickly or easily. This goes with modern natural sciences. And so most people who are actually doing stuff in the field are like Darwin. They're doing it on their own, basically. And Darwin, by the way, has independent means. I'll get back to this in a moment. Um, One other thing to note about this, by the way, and I'll get this when I talk about Thomas Huxley, is that, and this you see the last note on that slide, the term scientist, the term we use, only dates from Darwin's lifetime. That idea of what a scientist is, so it's very recent in terms of its vintage, and he's coming at the end of this or beginning of this process, actually, in a certain sense, and so his ideas, as I'll point out in a moment, they're going to hit the profession as much as they're going to hit the rest of society. I'll come back to that. So that's the first part of our little lecture um, about evolution pre-Darwin. So come to the next part of the lecture. You go to the next slide. Darwin and the Origin of Species, the work we're going to read. So a couple of things about his life. You see his dates up there, 1809 to 1882. He was born to a very illustrious family. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a famous scientist in his own right, while his father had been a doctor. So he came from means. He was a man of means. In fact, Darwin tried his hand at medicine first. He went to the University of Edinburgh for his college experience. Didn't find it to his liking. Then switched and went to Cambridge early in his life with the intent of becoming a clergyman. He was actually ordained a deacon originally. But while I was at Cambridge, he met several professors, among whom a couple of names you don't need to know, John Stevens Henslow and Adam Sedgwick, who instructed him in respectively botany and geology, respectively. And this changed his life, partly because Henslow got him onto botany. He loved collecting plants, and and you see the picture, by the way, of Darwin. That's Darwin's picture from 1859. And you can see, by the way, if you notice in the background of the slides, I have the slide has the sort of, progress from ape to human being there, and it's cute or whatever. But Darwin, 1859, year of his publication of On the Origin of Species. That was crucial, meeting this guy Henslow, because he managed to secure for him a post on the Beagle. And I just want to linger, by the way, on Darwin for a second. You can see what he looked like. He's the sort of Victorian gentleman, and it's the Victorians are weird. I don't have much time to go over British Victorian society. They're kind of strange. They're not as uptight as you'd think. You tend to get this image, though that's kind of propaganda from later generations. Lots of things going on in the Victorian period. And long story short, I won't get into it, but you kind of see him there. I just love these Victorian poses. That's why I linger on this, right? They're very stolid, and they have the tie and all of other stuff. And But they're very much flesh and blood people, as was Darwin. Darwin, though, by the way, just his personality, he was kind of, he's what you'd expect. He's a scientist. He likes collecting his plants and his fossils and doing his thing. He was kind of a shy guy. He was not necessarily a propagandist or a promoter of himself. As we're going to see, he has promoter of his own who aggressively promote him. But um, I admit, I kind of, by the way, just lingering on Victorian fashion for a moment, my weird digressions. I like the frock coats. I like the cravats. I like vests. I think it was really cool. Those pants are hideous in any century, I have to say. These checkered. I don't know what it. I don't know. I don't know how he got into that, but Victorians were weird. Is my point. But moving on to something actually important. The real thing this happens in Cambridge is this professor gets him a post on the HMS Beagle, which was the traveling around the globe, and he went on this voyage of the Beagle for 5 years between 1831 and 1836. And this is crucial. It will seal his decision to become a scientist. And he will go around collecting and gathering samples of plant and animal life in places like, most famously, the Galapagos Islands, where he'll mention this in his Origin of Species, where he first getting the idea for, oh, look at the comparison of these, species and how they're related and all this stuff. And in particular, he's going to publish his research based on his findings from the voyage. And that will make his name within the scientific community. That will make him a figure well before he publishes on the Origin of Species. So he's already made a name for himself as an independent scholar, as a amateur scientist, well before the Voyage of the Beagle, well before the publication of his work. So how and why do we get this? Big explosion with his book? Okay, so he basically sits on. I say sits on. He is working through his research, the stuff he found the Beagle, for about 20 some odd years, and it took him a long time. And people knew, by the way, he was working on this. He was corresponding with people. The idea was kind of in the air, as I kind of mentioned before. There were precedents for what he was writing about, and by 1859, he's pretty much ready to publish his work. But at the same time, another scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, had already worked out a theory of evolution very similar to Darwin's, independent of him. And in fact, Wallace probably got there before him. In fact, but if you wonder why we don't know not Wallace's name and not Darwin's, it's because Wallace knew who Darwin was and deferred to him. He basically said, "Yeah, you go ahead and publish first." Why? Wallace was a younger scientist. Darwin was already established. It was a deference to the older, more established guy there. And the big thing about his theory, I mentioned this before. We're talking about change of species over time. And you go from material succession, this idea of progression of forms, and all this stuff. There's a couple of big things he's going to contribute, but the biggest thing Darwin will contribute in terms of this idea is his theory of natural selection, the mechanism by which evolution is supposed to occur. And so, in place of either a theological account where God's providence makes things change, or the idea of progressive development, which was the popular, by the way, theory at the time, both Darwin but also Alfred Russel Wallace came to this independently, that species which were best adapted to their local environment, given, by the way, a struggle over a limited food supply vis-a-vis the population, so that's that Malthusian idea coming in, they would pass on their offspring, while those which were less adapted would die out. And therefore they'd pass on their characteristics. And that's how species would change over time, basically. It's basically adaptation. That's the big key phrase there. And by the way, local adaptations. That doesn't work the same way everywhere. What that means in one locale can be different than the others. And Darwin mentions this, I think, in The Origin of Species. And so what this means, by the way, one of the reasons why this is so earth-shattering is that this means that lots of species have died out in the course of the world's existence. And if you're wondering why, I'll come back to this in a moment, why that might be disturbing. It means there's a lot more death than maybe people had thought before in nature. And it will affect people's idea of nature for this. And And one of the things about that, by the way, this idea of of natural selection is it seemed to work, of course, independently of the creator. And by the way, Darwin, in his initial edition of Origin of Species, makes no reference to the creator. I think in the edition I give you, if you're using it, in the second edition, he inserts the word creator in there, which is interesting. Um, Although Alfred Russel Wallace didn't like the idea of natural selection because he thought it implied some sort of creator, selecting terms in there. And Wallace is one of the people who would popularize, by the way, the term survival of the fittest, which I'll get back to, which, by the way, Darwin never uses. We'll come back to that as well. Um, just a couple of notes about the origin of species. Um, the book was an immediate bestseller. It went through multiple printings, which again, the numbers wouldn't be spectacular in our terms, but for a science book, and by the way, it is not a work, by the way, it's not an academic work. It was meant to appeal to the public. This is one of the other reasons why it has the impact that it has. And Darwin's a good writer, actually. I don't find plant species, animal stuff very interesting, but he's a fine, fine writer. Similar to Galileo, though Galileo is much, much more of a propagandist than Darwin was, but very, very, very well presented to the community, and becomes a bestseller, maybe because of the controversy aroused by it. Um, but Darwin had defenders in his lifetime. In particularly, particularly, um, his biggest defender is a man named Thomas Huxley, and Thomas H. Huxley, who, if you don't know, by the way, was the grandfather of um, Aldous Huxley, the novelist and scientist. Um, Huxley defended Darwin's idea in a famous debate in 1860 with Samuel Wilberforce, an Anglican clergyman. By the way, if you don't know that name, Wilberforce, his father, William Wilberforce, had been the driving force behind ending the slave trade in the British Empire. So this is a prominent guy he's talking with, and it's a fascinating debate, in terms of Victorian culture, because you have the religion versus the science, all this stuff, secular, all that stuff. Nobody actually took notes of their debate, um, but newspaper accounts basically had, this big dramatic moment where Wilberforce supposedly asked Huxley whether it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed descent from a monkey. And then Huxley is said to have replied that he would not be ashamed to have a monkey for his ancestor, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used his great gifts to obscure the truth. And supposedly, when Huxley said this, like women in the crowd fainted, ha ha, Victorian, stereotype and all that stuff. In fact, by the way, William Wilberforce was a really brilliant, really bright guy. He was a mathematician, amateur mathematician himself. Just didn't understand the mechanics of science very well, but became a real big sort of cause célèbre in terms of the defense of this. And Huxley, as you're going to see, I give you a picture in the next slide, got that moniker Darwin's Bulldog because he defended Darwin so aggressively in public. And I'll come back to Huxley in a moment, but I give you that little selection from him as readings because he was a propagator of, we'll get to this in a moment, science as a guide for life type. And Huxley was a guy, Darwin was a very interesting guy. He started out as a religious person. By the end of his life, he was not. Darwin's wife was a religious person, and so we're thinking about the science faith thing. Huxley hated religion. In his letters from 1859 to Darwin, when they're talking about this theory he's developing, you can find these letters on the internet, by the way. They're very striking. He knows the uses to which this theory can be put in social terms, which is to say, he hopes it's going to undermine people's religion. He says at one point in one of the letters that he writes to Darwin that he feels now, I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact phrase, that we have our foot on the necks of our enemies, and by enemies he means the Church of England, and so Huxley doesn't like them very much. And I'll explain. By the way, he has more than just philosophical differences. I'll come back to this in a moment. It has to do with the professions in the 19th century. But in any case, one of the things that comes out of this theory, once it gets accepted, and I'll come back to the reception of his ideas in a moment, is this idea of survival of the fittest. Darwin never used that phrase originally, And his use of the phrase throughout his writings is very inconsistent later on. And in fact, it'll be coined not by Darwin, um, but by Herbert Spencer, who is I'll get back to in a moment, is a sociologist or early social thinker. And we'll use it to imply that some races are fitter than others, some people are fitter than others. And again, by the way, the term fittest is actually very misleading in terms of Darwin's actual idea. His idea of natural selection is impersonal and it's morally neutral. It's also, again, it doesn't mean survival of the strongest, the best looking, the fact. It means people who just happen to be, or people, there I go again, species or members of a species that are most well adapted to certain circumstances. Has nothing to do with strength or being better. In other words, his idea of evolution gets rid of the idea of a progression from worse to better forms. That's all gone. It's just random adaptations basically. I don't by the way mean random in a philosophical sense, but in a statistical sense. They don't add up to anything in a quantitative view of things. And so Darwin came a sort of celebrity, much again, by the way, against his will. And one of the reasons why is that people, of course, were afraid of the implications of applying this to human beings, which he did, by the way. Later in life, he published The Descent of Man, in which he explicitly applies his theory to human development, which, again, we'll come back to this. And he's applying this to their biological development. It's very important to point this out. He never, by the way, said this was incompatible with any sort of religious faith or anything like that, but he meant their physical, biological development. He also, by the way, further develops his theory of sexual selection, which I'll come back to in a minute. His theory of sexual selection is how certain species, how male and female members of a species attract each other. It's actually really interesting. It's one of the things you can talk about for Thursday if you like. I say this because modern contemporary scholars have actually investigated this, and they found that Darwin, he was investigating, by the way, how species it's known that like male peacocks, like they'll whatever they'll try to attract a mate by bright colors and all this stuff. One of the things that made Darwin's theory of sexual selection interesting is he said that females did the same thing of species, that there was an engagement to attract mates like this. And one of the things modern, particularly feminist scholars have found out is that Darwin not only was interested in examples from plant life, he actually collected, if you can believe this, advertisements from Victorian fashion magazines. Again, as examples of the theory of sexual selection of women, trying to attract mate. And why is this significant? By the way, it's not that significant in scientific terms, I guess, in a way, but in social terms, you have to remember in the 19th century, it was normal to think of men as having a sex drive. It was not normal for thinking of women having a sex drive. So his idea is actually kind of, by the way, it was scorned at first by the scientific community. They didn't think, well, the female of the species is passive, right? This is traditional way of thinking. He went beyond all that. And so it was actually a very interesting, and this is, by the way, we do know, just another aside here, his theory was influenced by cultural developments in the 19th century. It wasn't something he came up purely as a scientist. I'm coming back. We'll come back to this in a moment. Some controversy about his beliefs about race and everything. So let's get to this. Third part of the lecture is the reception of Darwin's ideas, which is probably the most important thing for us, I think. First thing, we have to talk about Victorian society, laissez-faire and Victorian society. And Darwin's ideas especially were popularized by people who the whole notion of a struggle for survival resonated in industrialized societies like America and Britain. Again, the idea of, that you work hard, you become rich. Naturally, the idea if you didn't get rich, that's because you're a lazy bum and you kind of deserve to be poor. I'm being crude there, by the way, but there's a lot of people who thought that already. And Darwin's ideas, they tend to give, they didn't tend to give it, people use that to buttress these ideas. And as when we get to Marx as well, one of the things industrialization does is it sweeps away, older traditional rural societies, and so it seemed like this idea of the survival of the fittest did away with dumb ideas like being charitable to the poor. Why help the poor out? They're just a drag on society and stuff like this. This made things like that seem kind of useless. Um, and so and then people like Herbert Spencer's the man, especially who's most associated with this idea. He coins the term survival of the fittest in 1864, and again, his idea, by the way, uh, he popularized, he sort of repurposed evolution as a progressive development. This is again, I think it goes back with, Darwin's theory is not susceptible to this critique. People saying that evolution, it goes from lower to higher forms, and that hey, if we've won out, if we're the best right now, we must be the best. That all that stuff was basically something he repurposes, and he uses the term. He popularizes a view of human society superficially based on it, in which again, this is the 19th century. People worship the idea of progress, that human society is getting better and better, and will eventually reach a state of perfection almost. The perfect man. That's his phrase there on the slide. If you see the perfect man and the perfect society. Notice, by the way, there's no woman in that equation, of course. Um, um, and this will be equated to, will come later on. We'll get to this in a moment. Social Darwinism is the next slide, which will be the term given to the application of Darwin's theory to human society. And this, among other things, it will be used to justify imperialism in the 19th century. And this is, again, a time when Europe, because of its technological advances, is dominating the world like it never has and never will again. Carving up, again, not even 1859, but definitely by the 1880s, Europe is controlling, as we'll get to, the colonialist section of the course, large swaths of the globe all over the place. And so you're going to have people saying, hey, we have these different races here. Um, we're obviously stronger than they are. We must be better at it. And they're not even use the term adapt, but we must be a superior race. This was almost a natural leap for people in the 19th century. And there's, it almost, I won't say it was inevitable once Darwin's ideas got into circulation, but it did sort of, it did become a big justifying factor for countries who build up their military and stuff like this. Why? Because there's a struggle for resources, and you have to be ready, prepared. Otherwise, some other country will take you over or destroy you. It gets into virtually every major thinker's wheelhouse, if you like, by the end of the 19th century. One other thing, by the way, that it also does is that it inspires the eugenics movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Um, one of Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, is actually, I think it's the Eugenics Society or something like this, as one of the main drivers of this in Britain. Although, to be fair, the British are never as enthusiastic as are two countries, United States and Germany, are about eugenics. Eugenics is widespread in the United States. Ideas of eugenics are widespread in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. And if you're wondering, by the way, what gets rid of it, it's the Holocaust that gets rid of it. Uh, but it does, that social Darwinist idea does stem from this extension of the theory of evolution. How much do these views reflect Darwin's? I don't think anybody believes Darwin was into offing other human races. I don't think anybody believes that. There are some debates. I don't think they're very important about how racist he was. And by the way, was he racist? Yeah, everybody was racist in the 19th century. And I'm not trying to excuse him. He had fairly conventional views of race. He was opposed to slavery, thought it was wrong. Darwin, again, was not a very, this is one of the ironies of his life. He was not a very public guy. He didn't like public attention. He was a scientist. He was a nerd. He just wanted to go off, play with his plants, write his books, and that's it. And so I think people, to me, the evidence doesn't support him having a real aggressive, imperialist, racist view of humanity. Um, I guess if there's one thing you want to criticize him for in that regard, um, you could say, and again, I don't think he deserves that much criticism myself. He knew, by the way, his ideas were going to be touchy. for two reasons. One, religion, but secondly, because they seem to you know take they seem to make humanity no longer special, right? You're not formed by a creator, touching you and then turning you. Oh, there you are. It seems to blunt humanity's uniqueness, which, by the way, I don't think it necessarily does, and we'll come back to the reception in a second. Um, and the next slide, if you go on from the last slide of social Darwinism, I have a picture from you. This is from the early 20th century. Called the eugenics tree. It's a very famous picture. It was spread about early 20th century. And you look at what it says. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity. And it goes all these different. I mean, look at the tree and its branches. All these different branches of science, which have nothing to do with biology, are being related to evolution. And this is one of the things we'll talk about this in a second. Is that evolution is a biological theory. It doesn't apply to anything outside of biology. um, I've heard people, we'll get to this in a moment, but I think this is one of the problems when, the natural sciences have such great success. People, I think, take the ideas which are, formed for a certain context and want to project them all over the place in places they don't really belong or fit. And this whole eugenics thing was one of those. Um, and yeah, it really interesting the way things play out. And again, if you wanted to criticize Darwin for something, you could say, okay, look, he was an intellectual. Shouldn't he have seen some of the uses to which his ideas can be put? Maybe. There's a recent biography written of Darwin by a guy named A.N. Wilson. I don't recommend it. I haven't read it. But it's highly critical of Darwin, is my point. He seems to blame him for the use that his ideas are put to in the 20th century, and I just don't know that that's fair. Um, I don't think he could have predicted all the ways that they went. Now, by the end of it, by the way, he basically did. He basically said, and he's right. Darwin does. This doesn't get rid of any idea of God if you don't want to. I don't think it does much for blunting humanity's uniqueness, to be honest with you. But maybe you can make that argument. I don't know. I'm not necessarily convinced. But this did have an effect, by the way, on religion to a certain, especially in intellectual life, it had certainly a big impact. Um, just a couple of things about why it did have an impact. Um, One is that by the couple of decades preceding the publication of The Origin of Species, um, a literal reading of the Bible had begun to be undermined among intellectuals, among learned people, by what's sometimes called the higher biblical criticism. This is usually refers to modern biblical studies, which begins more or less in Germany in the late 18th century. And what this means, by the way, higher criticism, just means treating the Bible as if it were any other text, which was created in a specific historical context and whose meaning is basically tied to that. Let's say it doesn't contain, you treat it as if it didn't contain eternal truths or revelation. You just treat it as any other book from a specific historical time place. It's an historicist reading of scripture, basically. And you increasingly have, especially liberal Protestant scholars. This is mostly a liberal Protestant thing. This mostly emerges in the Protestant world in Germany in the early 19th century. Again, treating the Bible as if it were just a collection of myths in the ancient Near East, stuff like this. Treating the stories in Genesis as if they're allegorical. So you already have people sort of warmed up for um, the Bible as if it had no historical truth. And so when Darwin comes along, you have to remember, and especially this is why I say the crisis of faith is mostly limited to the Protestant world. It's mostly limited basically to America and Britain. Why? Because the evangelical movement in the 19th century emphasized a very literal reading of the Bible. And again, why this is just give me some comparison here. Again, in Protestantism, Bible is the only authority. So, and of course, in Christianity, of course, it's supposed to be Christian faith is supposed to be accessible to everybody. The easiest way to read things, of course, is in their literal sense. Anybody can do that. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to have a PhD in theology to understand the Bible if you read it literally. Once, of course, it becomes clear, and this is, by the way, already happening, I should say, before the theory of evolution already gets there. I don't think this is as big of a deal, actually, as some people make it out to be. I think what's a bigger deal for a literal reading of, say, Genesis or the age of the world or something like this, is actually the discovery that the world's a hell of a lot older than we thought it was, which people have already suspected well before Darwin, or actually learned before Darwin. That's a more disturbing thing than evolution when you first hear about it. Like, oh God, Earth is like millions of years old, billions of years old. Those time scales are so vast; they seem kind of frightening. Whereas I don't think as I guess personally, but even by the way, why that's more impactful, say in the Protestant countries like America and Britain than say Catholic ones. There's two reasons. One, in the Protestant world, again, you're supposed to come to faith on your own just by reading the Bible. And it's kind of do it DIY, do it yourself. Well, it becomes that much harder, of course, if you take a literal reading out of it. Whereas in the Catholic world, you're supposed to accept the authority of the church and its teachings, its interpretations of Scripture. So not everybody has to do that. You could say it made you more independent-minded, I guess, in the Protestant world. But now, of course, the science seems to be undercutting that. The second reason is that the Catholic Church is old and has long traditions of reading the Bible in different ways other than the literal. Allegorical readings, for example, of Genesis have long been prevalent. And so, for those reasons, the faithful are kind of shielded from this more or less in the Catholic world. And so it's more or less related to Protestantism, which, by the way, it's not universal. It's not as if everybody loses their faith all of a sudden. It's mostly limited to educated people, which again sometimes people overdo this, but it is kind of poignant. By the way, stories of people like if you don't know who Edmund Goss is, Stephen Goss was oh, excuse me, Philip Goss is his name, was a clergyman, 19th century Britain, and also an amateur paleontologist, and he tried to square evolution with his, or try to keep his literal reading of the Bible intact by arguing that fossils were hidden in the record by God to test people's faith and stuff like this. And I mention this because he's famous because his son Edmund became a free thinker later in his life, and he talks about how this clash between science and faith estranged him from his father. They fell out over this. And there's some really sad, poignant stories about this in these countries like this. Um, but it wasn't universal. In fact, I would say, quite honestly, again, going back to industrialization, I think industrialization actually had more to do, if there was any sort of crisis of faith in the 19th century, than this. I don't have time to explain it here. I'm going to be able to come back to it in Marx, but I think it's kind of overdone to a certain degree. Definitely among intellectuals, it causes a crisis, but I mean, religious practice in Europe doesn't fall off a cliff until the 1960s. So I'm very much doubting that it does have an effect. I mean, we're wrong, but I think it could be overdone. Um, we're doing out of time, but one last thing, just about science, because you're probably thinking in terms of, okay, where do the fundamentalists come from? Just to give you an idea, there's a rift over theological modernism, which affects. I mentioned the popular idea of Darwinism doesn't really affect the Catholic world very much. Theological modernism affects all the Christian world, and modernism. I'm not going to go into this. This gets written about a lot. In general, is a theological position which basically says that traditional beliefs, you name them, the Trinity, resurrection, miracle, something like that, are not compatible with modern society because something, there was one liberal Protestant theologian of the early 20th century who said that we can no longer believe in the resurrection because we have, because we can turn on a light with a flick of a switch. It's just impossible for modern men to believe, which sounds like a non sequitur to me, but this is the idea, is that, because we have all this science, we can't believe in this. And this caused big rifts especially within the Protestant world. I mentioned on the slide you have there the Fundamentals of 1909. This is a manifesto issued by a bunch of academic theologians in places like Britain and the United States and elsewhere, Protestant ones, restating basic fundamental Protestant doctrines of sola scriptura, faith alone, and stuff like that, against theological modernism. I say that because these were actually credentialed, respected academics. That's where the term fundamentalist comes from. It gets applied to people later on as a sort of slur. who don't accept things like evolution, but it really didn't have anything to do with that in the beginning. That'd be interesting to note that. So it does open up a rift between faith and science to a certain degree. It also, by the way, kind of completes the rift between the science and the humanities, really. Um, Darwin's ideas um, were greeted for the most part with acceptance in the scientific community. Um, there was, by the way, some disagreement over the extent to which natural selection actually operated. For example, Thomas Huxley actually disagreed with Darwin about natural selection being the only thing that causes species to change over time. And actually still are debates like this within the scientific community, from what I understand. Like, can it explain everything? And does change always work through local adaptations slowly over time, or does it get sped up? There are debates about this. Um, but it definitely had an effect again on, severing science, science as the natural sciences. And the reason why, by the way, science, if you don't know the Latin term, it means knowledge. And so by the end of the 19th century, it became, when we think of knowledge, we're thinking of the way it's, the way it's produced within the natural sciences. It really does help turn the humanities into, what people think of as being really loosey goosey, mostly subjective stuff by the end of the 19th century. That's a pretty it's a pretty interesting thing. I mentioned, by the way, the sciences. They become established in universities for the first time. Into the 19th century, I used to do a whole lecture on um, the secularization of education, but long story. But end of the 19th century, most countries have secularized their higher education establishments. Before that, by the way, and this gets us back into why there's such a bitter conflict between people like Huxley and Wilberforce. In universities at the time of Darwin, his writing of the Origin of Species, most senior professors in the sciences in universities were clerics. So when Huxley's talking about, our enemies, he's probably thinking about people whose jobs he wants. And in fact, what happens in the late 19th century is that, first of all, the government steps in and reforms. Cambridge and Oxford had been in desperate need of reform for centuries, actually, and they finally did this. But they also established the University of London, which was a science which was established to actually practice the modern natural sciences. And by the end of the century, they were in the universities, ensconced there for the first time. So they've come to really dominate ever since. I mean, people will still think of the humanities. I'm a humanities guy, obviously, as being the heart of the university, but in terms of funding, prestige, it's all tied to science in a lot of ways, as we understand it in the modern world. Um, and by the way, ever since then, many thinkers have been concerned about the breakdown between the humanities and the sciences, how they seem to have nothing to say to each other. It seems to make our scientific knowledge, threaten our understanding of our humanity, that sort of thing. Many people were concerned about this. Many people tried to bridge the gap. In the late 1860s, something called the Metaphysical Club was established by a bunch of Victorian thinkers, people like Henry Manning, Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet, John Ruskin, the painter and art critic, William Gladstone, the English Prime Minister, but also Thomas Huxley, who would meet to discuss philosophical or metaphysical questions about life and decide them by majority vote. And the idea was to try to bridge the gap between, okay, how does scientific understanding and our our desires for what we think of ourselves as being human, and didn't really work. Broke up after 10 years, basically. Didn't really resolve too much. And again, this kind of goes back to, in some ways, if you go back to my earlier lecture on Galileo, the whole idea of disenchantment, the disenchantment of nature, and Enlightenment thought. Darwin's ideas seem to bring that to fruition, in that they seem to bring a sort of conflict between our human understanding of ourselves and the natural world. And I say this, by the way, to give you an idea that this is, I don't mean to underplay the kind of problems this could cause. I don't think it's the theories itself. I think it's a philosophical attitude. Again, I think it's the mistake of taking natural science as the only form of legitimate knowledge, produces the only form of legitimate knowledge. But to give you an idea in terms of Darwin's life, Darwin, we have letters, and they're very sad in some ways, poignant letters, in which later in his life, he writes to people about that. I'm paraphrasing some of this. He basically he could enjoy nothing anymore by the end of his life except for science. That was the only thing that gave him pleasure anymore. We have letters, for example, in which he says he can no longer read Shakespeare. It just seems dull to him anymore. Um, Another letter read of his, he talks about talking to a friend of his who had gone to see Handel's Messiah, the great oratorio by George Handel, composer. And he says, "I'm glad you went to see Handel, but I simply can't listen to music anymore. I'm a drudge for everything but science," that he says. And he writes, I think it's another letter, that the loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness for me. It's really sad in some ways. My point is that he's not actually reacting. He's reacting to the reception of his ideas. The reception of his ideas is colored not by science itself, but by a philosophical position what's sometimes called positivism. And this is really, it really does poison people's minds. I'll put it, I think it's a bad thing. Obviously, you've gotten that point in the lecture. It really does take, only things that can be proved are the ones that have sort of scientific rationale behind them. And again, it's kind of a sad thing. Um, Also, by the way, there's a book about this. I can't remember who wrote it, about the relationship between Darwin and his wife, because again, one of the reasons why um, he was sensitive to what his ideas might do to religion is, I remember he was not a religious man by the end of his life. His wife was. She was a Unitarian Christian, so he understood some of those. Did understand some of the disenchanting aspects of his theory. And onto my last slide. I want to show you. I'm going to read something to you. I remember I bring this up. I forgot to bring it up before I started this lecture. The last slide's called the Darwin Show. And in thinking about the way Darwin's idea helps transform our view of nature and everything, you know, one of the things that's most crazy about Darwin is that, people admire Galileo, they admire Newton, they admire, you name it, other scientific figures, is that Darwin's basically become the focus of a cult in the modern world. Um, and I take, by the way, the name of that slide from a very good article I recommend to you. I used to actually assign it last time I taught this course. Um, by Stephen Chapin, who's one of the great living historians of science, which he wrote about 10 years ago in 2009 in the London Review of Books, in which he talks about the celebrations that were surrounding the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. And I just want to read to you the first few paragraphs. This is really fascinating, I think. I was going to read this in class. I'll read it here. And here's the first few paragraphs to give you an idea just how. Well, let me read this to you. I'm quoting here. Okay. The Darwin Show. It has been history's biggest birthday party. On or around 12 February 2000, February 12th, 2009 alone, the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth, Darwin Day, there were more than 750 commemorative events in at least 45 countries, and on around 24th November, there was another spate of celebrations to mark the 150th anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species, etc., etc. The working to read for Thursday. In Mysore, that's in India, Darwin Day was observed by an exhibition, quote, proclaiming the importance of the day and the greatness of the scientist, unquote. In Charlotte, North Carolina, there were performances of a one-man musical, Charles Darwin, live and in concert. He quotes from from one of the songs here, quote, "'Twas adaptive radiation that produced the mighty whale. His hands have grown to flippers, and he has a fishy tail," unquote. At Harvard, the celebrations included, quote, "free drinks, science-themed rock bands, cake, decor, and a dancing gorilla," unquote, stuffed with a relay of biology students. Circulating around the university, student and faculty volunteers declaimed the entire text of the Origin. On the Galapagos Islands, tourists making scientific hajj were treated to, quote, "an active, life-seeing account of the life of this magnificent scientist," unquote. And a party of Stanford alumni retraced the circumnavigating voyage of the HMS Beagle in a well-appointed private Boeing 757, intellectually chaperoned by Darwin's most distinguished academic biographer. The Darwin anniversaries were celebrated round the world, in Bogota, Mexico City, Montevideo, Toronto, Toulouse, Frankfurt, Barcelona, Bangalore, Singapore, Seoul, Osaka, Cape Town, Rome, where it was sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Culture, part of the Vatican Hatchet Bearing Initiative, and in all the metropolitan and scientific settings you might expect. The English 10-pound note has borne Darwin's picture on the back since 2000, replacing Charles Dickens, but special postage stamps and a new 2-pound coin honored him in 2009, as did stamps or coins in at least 10 other countries. Darwin had an anniversary Facebook group dedicated to him. Its goal was to have 200,000 unique happy birthdays, posted by the 12th of February, and a million quote-unquote friends by the November anniversary of the origin. The group also planned a mass, quote, happy birthday Darwin, unquote, sing-along, but I don't think this actually happened. Then there were the Darwin-themed t-shirts, teddy bears, bobbleheads, tote bags, coffee mugs, fridge magnets, mouse mats, scatter cushions, and pet bowls. The quote, Darwin loves you, unquote, bumper stickers. Quote, Darwin is my homeboy, unquote, badges, and my personal favorite. The quote, I heart Darwinism, unquote, thongs. I heart Darwinism thongs. The opening line of the year's most substantial historical contribution, Adrian Desmond and James Moore's Darwin's Sacred Cause, is this, quote, global brands don't come much bigger than Charles Darwin, unquote. Quite right, so saith Stephen Shapin. And again, I think you can kind of see one of the reasons I wanted to read that to you, and I think it's a great, by the way, it's a long article, like 20 pages you printed out. The article talks about the way it's been received, the ambivalence of Darwin's impact on society. Obviously, it's been a great boon for our scientific understanding of the natural world. You can't go through that in any way and not say it's a good thing. On the other hand, and by the way, a lot of this conflict, such as it has existed, has been unnecessary. I'll say that. But it has caused conflict. And again, not a lot of it, I don't think, attributable to him. But by ambivalence, when I say ambivalence, I think we're all a little bit ambivalent about this, but I'm thinking about, my colleague back at KU when I was teaching there. If you don't know, there's a wonderful Center for the Humanities on campus at KU, the Hall Center for the Humanities. I'm the man that directs it. And I remember when I was still there as a graduate student, they had this big thing on Darwin there one time. And the poster advertising for it said that, had a, advertisement said, Darwin for evolution for everyone was the title of this talk or something. How evolution impacts our lives and all those how all this positive, it's a positive impact on all these things. And one of the other parts of this, whatever theme thing they were having was, well, I'm a paraphrase, but it was the evils of, social Darwinism and treating people as if they were, race theory, stuff like that. And my thinking was, that's really schizophrenic, isn't it? Can you say that evolution has a great impact on the one hand? I don't know how. On the one hand, well, it's a good thing for society. On the other hand, it's bad. Like, well, once you apply that idea, which is again a biological thing, I mean, it's appropriate for the study of biology, to human society. I don't think you can take it back. Any of the negative effect it's going to have. Either it's something that should stay in biology, or if you're going to let it go. I mean, that's the thing. Once you put it out there, it's not like, I don't think you can have it both ways. You can't say that it only has a good impact and just bad people that use it for bad. I think it has the impact it has once it gets out there. So to me, it's an ambivalence of the theory, which again, I don't think there's need to go into this, assign blame to people. It has the potential for that. No, has had, even if it is this, had a great impact on the internal workings of science in a lot of ways. But it also raises again the conflicts. It raises again that problem of expertise we talked about with Galileo. People are experts in biology, and evolution is, it's basically been, details, and there are still, by the way, debates within that arena of biology. No one debates that this is actually how a lot of species change, right? The conflicts between that, and then you have people who, who take this idea. Some of them are scientists, others are philosophers, and run with it to try to create, an entire theory of the universe. Everything can be referred back to Darwin's theory of evolution. I mean, literally, if you read Steve Shapin's article, he mentions scientists who do just that. And this is, I'll go ahead and say that I think this is illegitimate. I don't, there are people, by the way, who want to, may have already mentioned it in this lecture, they treat the theory of evolution as if it was applied to things like physics or something like. It's like no, it's a biological theory. It's a theory about biological species, um, which is again, I think that's the problem of having this really really powerful expertise in a very narrow subject and being tempted to project that in other areas where it's really not appropriate. Is my point. Um, and I just read a review of a book about Darwin, critical of him, and the reviewer was trying to defend scientists. Well, no true scientist would ever you know abuse Darwin's theory that way. I'm like, sorry, there are a lot of them who abuse it. I've heard lots of scientists do that actually. Again, most of them know, by the way. I actually have good friends, scientists, biologists actually up at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. He cringes when he hears stuff like that. But there are plenty of ones who can't resist. This is the last thing I have on the slide there. They can't resist the temptations of celebrity. And aligned with, by the way, philosophers who are prominent among the new atheist types, they're the ones who really push this. The idea that, who I'm talking about, the Richard Dawkinses, the E.O. Wilsons, that basically Darwin explains everything. Darwin got everything right. He is sort of this cultic figure before which we must, burn incense before a statue of his, and swear allegiance to the creed of Darwin, in the name of Darwin, Huxley, and I don't know somebody else. I believe in Darwin the Father Almighty, that sort of thing. You get the idea. It becomes kind of creepy. The Darwin Show is creepy. I'll say that. I can't get over the I Heart Darwinism thongs. That's really weird and creepy. But you get the idea. It shows you how it's very hard to separate the science from the social conditions in which it has to operate. And it's really difficult to do that for us. And yet I think we see better than they did at the time in terms of Darwin, how we can do that. That's maybe one of the things we can talk about for Thursday if you want to get into that. And so I'm going to come back to the last slide. Has the key terms again: natural selection, Thomas Malthus; social Darwinism; sexual selection, Charles Lyell, Thomas Huxley. And that's it. That's the lecture for today. I hope that helps you guys a little bit. I'm probably going to send you guys an email. I think I'm going to have put you guys in groups again at the beginning of Darwin's discussion of Darwin to give you guys. Again, it's easy enough to read, but it's a little bit on the dry side. So hope this was helpful. See you guys on Thursday. Hopefully it will not be nasty, cold, wet, and rainy. So see you guys then.